Welcome, everybody. Today I am speaking with and have the pleasure of having on our session Erick Simpson and Rich Freeman, and we are going to be talking about vendors, specifically how many vendors is too many vendors, how to go about choosing your specific stack, and how these choices potentially impact valuations. So I think most of you will know me. I'm Hartland Ross, the president of eBridge Marketing Solutions and the MSPbroker.com. And we publish a list of opportunities of companies for sale in the IT services space, including MSPs, obviously, weekly on Wednesdays. And you're welcome to subscribe to our mailing, which is free. You can go to the MSPbroker.com and register there. And if you have any questions, you can certainly reach out to us as well, info@themspbroker.com. So with that, and without any further ado, can I pass it over to Erick, you and Rich for quick introductions?
You bet. And yeah, thanks for having me on again, Hartland. You invited me on a couple of times. Always interesting conversations, and appreciate the outreach and the fireside chat that we like to have based on different topics. And I'm looking forward to today's session. My name's Erick Simpson. I'm a former MSP. I built and sold one of the first MSPs in the channel in the early 2000s, then launched MSP University and worked with tens of thousands of MSPs over the last, call it 15 years, and now work with channel vendors as well with my partner in crime, Rich Freeman, over at Channel Mastered. So you can check out what we do for vendors over at Channel Master and help connect them with MSPs and build channel programs and strategies and all kinds of fun stuff that helps the channel grow in unison together.
And I am Rich Freeman. I am Erick's business partner at Channel Mastered. I am also the founder and executive editor of Channelholic, which is a blog about the SMB channel, www.channelholic.news if you're curious. And before that, I was the founding editor and longtime executive editor at the Channel Pro Network.
Excellent. Well, thank you guys so much again for joining. I think that what I wanted to talk about here was first of all just have a discussion around how many vendors an MSP might want to consider having, and if we look at it sort of quickly, we're talking about increased complexity with additional vendors. Obviously, there's a potential for pricing issues, right? Where hey, if you consolidate your vendor stack, you get better pricing with a vendor at a sort of a scale basis. And then the other challenge, of course, is just staying current with training when you have all these different vendors having to manage them all and provide training to your team. Are there cases like how would you comment on this issue? Like what do you teach? What do you propose as a sort of an approach in this question?
Rich, go first.
Okay, well, I will dive in. So, I mean, the key question you're asking is, how many vendor relationships is the right number? And obviously, there's no one answer to that question, but I think data that I can cite for you makes it pretty clear that the channel's answer to the question is fewer than I have now. There was some research from CompTIA earlier in the year in which they showed that 29% of partners are enrolled in 1 to 4 programs. 11% of partners are enrolled in no partner programs right now. And those numbers are up. There used to be a lot of partners who were enrolled in a dozen different partner programs. And that's changing. You're seeing vendors concentrating more on a smaller number of vendors. And IDC has some data showing that 4/5 of partners that they surveyed want to get their vendor relationships to less than 6 by the end of this year. And you pointed to some of the really critical issues, why that makes sense. The overhead and and the expense. I'll just add one other factor that I think is weighing on this, which is we're seeing more and more partners shift their business model away from resale towards services. They're selling more stuff, or excuse me, selling less stuff and more services. And once you kind of get out of the stuff business, there are certain vendor relationships you don't need as much anymore. They're not necessarily adding value for you. And the obvious example is in the hardware world. If I'm kind of pointing my partners to distributors or, direct to the vendor to get their hardware, I'm maybe giving them some advice. I don't necessarily need the overhead of maintaining a relationship with Dell or Lenovo or whoever it is. And there are similar situations where some of the SaaS applications that end users are using right now are very easy to procure either through a marketplace or direct from the vendor. A lot of these vendors, the younger ones, the startups in particular, don't even really have partner programs in some cases. And so that too is another factor that would contribute to MSPs having fewer vendor relationships these days.
Yeah, and I'd like to tag in on what we like to call vendor sprawl and platform sprawl situation that more and more MSPs find themselves in today. And, it's a combination of things that I think started from the early days of the MSP's business practice, where they've, engaged in a lot of partner programs and vendor relationships. And then as the needs of their customers change over time and the focus shifts to more cybersecurity and now maybe AI opportunities and business process optimization opportunities, we're seeing these MSPs, tend to add more and more to their stack, to their portfolio, and then try to figure out how to charge for it and how to get all of their clients to true up over time. And this additional complexity not only adds more costs from these services and platforms and deliverables that are being added to the solution stack, but they're also adding increased labor costs and straining the ability of these MSPs to scale more effectively because of the added labor that's required. So we've got a lot of these stressors and pressures on MSPs that are building an unsustainable growth model, which is driving MSPs to do what, Rich just alluded to and what you posited, Hartland, is to reduce that sprawl, is how do we consolidate, how do we eliminate a lot of these additional costs and these multiple dashboards and in-between times that our technicians are having to expend in delivering service, which again adds to inefficiency, adds to scalability issues, and impacts valuations. And one last thing I'll add is the propensity for some of the vendors that are now buying and acquiring other vendors to add to their own portfolio to kind of keep their partners in their partner program, focused on their partner program, is making it easier for partners to buy in on one vendor and their solutions that are already integrated and add to efficiencies in billing and reporting and things like that. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention Microsoft's charge on delivering more and more cybersecurity services in their basic licenses, and then maybe some add-on licenses that partners are also gravitating towards because it's dropping the cost of those cybersecurity portfolio vendors and platforms that they have historically brought on board with their clients. So there's a lot going on here, and I'm really looking forward to, diving deeper into some of these areas, Hartland.
Yeah. So look, you're talking here, I've got lots of thoughts going on in my head, and I'm going to fast forward to a question I was going to ask you a little bit later, which is this idea of best of breed versus the kind of the platform or ecosystem, right? So I'm MSP. I want to look out for my customers. I want to provide the best service. And underlying that service is the products that are supporting it. And so now I'm in this kind of difficult situation of wanting to choose the best of breed, which is going around and cherry picking the right solutions, or do I streamline everything? And as you said, it is becoming easier because the platforms are they're acquisitive, and they're rolling up these vendors, and so they're making it, on the one hand, easier for MSPs because, hey, now everything is streamlined, it is integrated, but at the same time, it may mean that it creates some difficult choices for MSPs.
Rich?
Well, this is a huge issue in the industry right now, and there are a lot of different approaches that the vendors are taking to it, right? But the really kind of classic showdown right now is between Kaseya and ConnectWise, and so Kaseya is all in on the idea that you are going to get everything you need from us, and all of that software is going to be integrated at a source code level, integrated in a way that APIs don't make possible. I did an interview with Fred Vacola, the CEO of Kaseya, just a few weeks ago, in which he scoffed at the idea that there is such a thing as best of breed. He basically said best of breed is a myth that single technology vendors made up to justify their higher prices. What MSPs need is a tightly integrated stack of technologies from one company at an extremely competitive price that puts a lot of money down to their bottom line. On the other hand, you have ConnectWise, a somewhat more nuanced kind of approach, where they are increasingly building out a platform of solutions, and more of what they offer on that platform is stuff that they are providing themselves to you. But I just did an interview with the new CEO of ConnectWise last week, and he made it pretty clear that relationships with third parties, companies that make products in categories ConnectWise will never compete in. Obvious example that he provided in the interview was EDR. We are never going to try to compete with SentinelOne. We're going to partner with SentinelOne. So it's not exactly, the ConnectWise stack is not exactly a best of breed stack. You're getting a lot of what you need from one vendor, and then kind of tacking on pieces from third parties there. And those connections are being made on the ConnectWise ASIO platform, which, according to ConnectWise, is going to kind of enable things to work together much more closely than they would with older school API kind of technology. It's very hard for me to say which approach is the better one for the MSPs out there. I will say this, though, because I heard some interesting data from a company called Pinecrest Capital Partners. They work with MSPs on the sell side and larger MSPs on the buy side. And they feel pretty strongly that the more consolidated, the more unified, the more integrated your stack, the fewer vendors in the stack, the higher your valuation is going to be, because it's just going to be easier for the acquirer to onboard you if you're not all over the map, essentially, and especially if you've standardized on the stack that the acquiring company already uses.
You're using some of my firepower up here, Rich, but we'll get there. So is this become? It seems to me that maybe it's becoming like a little bit of a good enough, right? Like, hey, this is not best of breed, but it's the trade-off is all these things that we've been talking about, and so, hey, this is good enough. Like, if it's good enough for everybody else in ConnectWise, it's good enough for me, good enough for my customers. Is that kind of a fair statement that there is some trade-off, but the trade-off's worth the consolidation?
Well, let me just jump in there quickly, Eric. I'm smiling a little bit because what you just said is almost exactly something that I said in that interview with Fred Vacola recently. I don't think I've ever seen him push back as hard on anything I've ever said to him as that. Because to him, to his ears, good enough means okay. Like,
Yeah.
not good, but good enough, okay. And I don't think that that's what any MSP want. To save money, you don't go with okay. What you need is something that is good, legitimately, solidly good, and good enough to get the job done in a serious way for your customer. At that point, do you need all of the bells and do you need best of breed? Do you need the best solution in that category, or do you need something that is really good and, in that sense, good enough? And that too is a question I think MSPs are wrestling with. Eric and I were both at the Kaseya conference where they announced Kaseya 365, this new offer that pulls together a lot of the technologies that you use and is offered at a crazy low price, basically. And I remember talking to an MSP I know from here in my hometown of Seattle, who was talking to me about, I have this MDR. He's like a big Blackpoint cyber guy. That's his MDR vendor of choice. And he's like, I sleep at night because I know those guys are on the job. But he's looking at the price difference between the MDR that comes with Kaseya 365 and what he's paying Blackpoint right now. And like at the show, hours after this offer was announced, he's just kind of starting to think a little bit. Is the Kaseya MDR good enough, or is Blackpoint so much better for me to justify all that? It's a difficult conundrum to be in.
Yeah.
I'm chomping at the bit to jump in, guys.
Go ahead. There's still more to say. All right.
So I'm going to do point counterpoint on this, right? Because, whatever these, platform vendors and ecosystem vendors say, at the end of the day, it's up to the MSP to determine what they feel is best. And so I'm gonna take the side of MSPs that I've talked to that are on the best of breed side of the conversation, and the risk averse, putting everything in one basket side of the conversation, right? Yeah. They will tell you that that's their distinction and differentiation. They want to distinguish themselves and differentiate themselves away from what they see as everybody else that's jumping into a portfolio of services that they feel is kind of that single, that's a risk, having everything in your, this one ecosystem. And I'm not taking sides here. I'm just sharing what I'm hearing, just like we're sharing data points in this conversation. What I will say is, yes, there is some risk when you put all your eggs in one basket, but is the risk acceptable? That's up to the MSP. Is the portfolio of services that's being delivered by one vendor or one source, I'm including Microsoft in this, is it, and I will use the term good enough, is it good enough to create distinction and differentiation? Is your value based on your portfolio and who you partner with, or based on the additional things that distinguish you from your competition? Because we've got ConnectWise partners and Kaseya partners that are competing against each other all day long and winning business or losing business, not based on what they're delivering, but based on their approach to delivering service to their clients. Some of the most successful MSPs that I've worked with are ones that have a bespoke portfolio of services, but are not targeting the SMB or the S in the SMB. They're targeting a very specific type of client or prospect, a vertical market, an industry where they have created, a very unique set of services that is valuable to those folks. They may have a few, Kaseya services, and there may be some ConnectWise, who knows, right? They're putting it together to serve that market and making their value proposition this boutique kind of bespoke, high level, high value, high price service with an eye on margins and efficiency and things like that. So this is a mature approach that some of these partners are taking. Would an all-in approach from a vendor be appealing to them? That's up to them, right? But there is no arguing the fact that MSPs are overwhelmed with the number of services and solutions in their portfolio. It's complicated for them to sell. It's complicated for them to price. It's complicated for them to manage, to deploy, to deliver, to onboard clients. So where's the happy medium? Is there a happy medium that can be struck? Up to the MSP to figure out. And again, the point that you made, Rich, about, and Hartland, you're going to chime in, I'm sure, about making themselves attractive for acquisition at an exit. Sometimes you have to look at what's best for your exit strategy along with what's best for your clients and take that long view rather than, what I'm doing today and what I'm going to look like in 3 years. Like, what is the ultimate strategy for you? Are you looking to grow through acquisition? Are you looking to exit? And what's the timeline? These are all critical questions that need to be answered in order for the MSP to make the best choice on who they partner with and how many vendors they participate with in their portfolio.
Yeah, look, so what this point about the differentiation, I think is an interesting one, because I would argue that in not all, but in most cases, the customer doesn't know and doesn't care who the vendors are in the behind the scenes anyway. And most MSPs are not putting those forward. They're not saying we're using SentinelOne, we're using whoever for backup and so forth. They're just saying these are the areas that we're going to cover off for you, right, as part of the package. And even if they did use the vendors, the customers may not have any opinion one way or the other on vendor A versus B. They're hiring an MSP to be able to make those decisions for them. Now, there's the odd one that has some sort of a preference, or maybe there's especially if it's like a co-managed situation or something like that, where they're a bit more educated and would have a preference. But that argument around the differentiation, like I get you're making that differentiation from your peers, but is that a marketing play, and is that a marketing play that's really going to have much benefit? And I suppose if there's belief that from a security perspective that because that's the one that keeps people up at night, that I can sleep better because I feel much more confident in vendor A than I do in vendor B that might be part of an ecosystem. Perhaps there's an argument there, but I don't know if either of you have thoughts on that point.
Well, I have a follow-on comment, and I'm glad you brought up the co-managed, conversation, because that is what will drive an MSP to choose a particular vendor over another. The more co-managed, and so when we're moving up from the SMB to the mid-market to the enterprise into the co-managed space, there's no question that coming out of the pandemic, or having to serve clients during the pandemic and the shutdown, opened up tremendous amounts of co-managed opportunities for MSPs that simply were not available before, because the internal IT teams felt there was a competition there. You're going to come take my job. But because of COVID-19 and because of the shutdown and because of having to support hybrid workforces, many of these internal IT departments were caught flat-footed. They were not ready to support everybody working from anywhere, and that's where MSPs saw this opportunity, and that segment has continued to grow. So when you're not responsible for the entire infrastructure, as some of the SMB clients are for these MSPs, where you are simply providing a specific set of services and you're answering to a technology decision maker or a security decision maker and not the CEO of the organization, then you pretty much need to adjust what you're delivering to meet their needs, or determine that, that's not a client for us because we're not going to support Blackpoint Cyber, for instance, right? So
right.
And I want to jump in because you were talking about differentiation and adding some nuance to that topic, Hartland. I mean, I agree completely with what you said. If you go to the customer and say, here's my tool stack, that is not differentiating, right? The customer does not care. And so that's not what's going to give you a competitive advantage. What might is if using this particular best of breed constellation of products that you've carefully assembled, you're able to deliver services or a level of service that is legitimately differentiated. And, like Erick was kind of talking about the scenario where you're going after a particular vertical industry or something like that. That's a good example. Another example might be the co-managed kind of case where you're dealing with companies that can and will spend more if they are getting more, and you can kind of show them that and demonstrate that to them. It's not going to involve giving them a rundown of the technologies you use. It's going to involve giving them a business level presentation of who you are and what you do and why it's different. knowing in the back of your head, the only reason I can do all of that is because I've put together this very special, perfect kind of combination of tools. That combination of tools is almost certainly costing you more than a more standardized single vendor or single vendor-ish set of products would. But if having that best of breed set of products allows you to deliver higher service and therefore charge more, you're probably going to come out ahead. If you have a best of breed set of products and you're pretty much doing the same thing as everyone else, and therefore pretty much charging the same as everyone else, it might actually hurt you on the bottom line.
Yeah, you're competing on price at that point, really, right? So.
Yeah. No, it makes perfect sense. Are there any cases where it might make sense for an MSP to have two competing solutions, two competing vendors? And I'm just thinking off the top of my head, like maybe you service enterprise customers and the SMB market, and so you need solution A, vendor A, that's more geared towards, might be more expensive towards enterprise, and solution B for your SMB customers. Is that have you seen that? Like, is there an argument there?
I've seen it where your good, better, and best options can swap in and out. Different versions of services or deliverables, or even completely unique services that don't appear in other bundles. And that's just, the more complexity that you introduce, you're going to give up efficiency, you're going to give up scalability, but it may make sense, right? I mean, do we support two different types of firewalls? And, in this very simple example, how many firewalls do we support? How many, cybersecurity solutions do we support? And that means that I've got to make sure that my team is trained on supporting each of those and keep them up to snuff. And then when I onboard a new technician, I've got to onboard them onto all these other different solutions. So it better make sense from a financial perspective, from other perspectives that may be important to that business owner. But when you're delivering services through, let's say, two competing vendors, that means that you're purchasing these things differently. That means that you're probably eroding some MDF opportunities and some love from a particular vendor and things like that. I mean, Hartland, I know you've seen this. I've seen it during M&A, transactions where you've got an acquiring company that's using one vendor solution and is doing, a lot of business with a particular vendor, and another one that's using the competitor. And now, in order to realize the synergy of that acquisition, you've got to make a decision, because, you can get a lot better volume discounts and MDF and love when you shift the business into one vendor's, shopping cart, if you will. Make sense?
Yeah, you've kind of perfectly segued into the next question I just want to talk about is this issue of valuation and what some of the drivers are. And I can speak from our side, and curious what your thoughts are, but certainly, I mean, everything you said would be valid. The other thing that we've seen is, and it's not as much as of a significant issue as I would expect, but it's nonetheless absolutely an issue, which is, hey, is this a ConnectWise shop? If so, I'm interested. If it's not a ConnectWise shop, I'm not interested. And so one could argue, well, okay, so that's just one buyer, right? 1 out of 100. We've got 99 buyers. That's fine. We only need one successful one. But nonetheless, groups do drop off in that process. And these things ultimately come down to a market, right? Buyers and sellers, and the more buyers you have, the more offers you get, and the more offers you get, the better the price, better the valuation, and so better a deal. And so, to the extent that you are aligned and not choosing some proprietary system that you built, or and I've seen that, right? Somebody built their own environment. Perhaps it's they did this back in the day when you couldn't buy things off the shelf so readily, or it wasn't very good. and so they built something on their own, or they built it to save costs, right? But the reality is that chances are the acquirer is going to go with the best of breed, or the stack, and so all of a sudden, although that margin is all dropping to the bottom line because it's a proprietary system that they developed in house, and so there's essentially no cost of goods sold associated with that. So the margins look great, but the buyer is not going to be able to realize that because they're not going to continue to sustain that, and they're not in the software business, so they don't want to be involved with sort of signing on for the ongoing support there. So like that's something that I've seen in the past, and I'm just kind of curious what other considerations that you've seen from the impact valuations. What are you guys noticing?
Yeah. No, I mean, it's interesting. So, and this kind of goes back to the Pinecrest Capital data that I was talking about before. I mean, not all of the acquiring activity in the M&A market for managed service providers right now is being done by these roll-ups, these bigger and bigger kind of private equity backed MSPs that are coming into business, but a lot of it is. And private equity and private equity backed MSPs, they love efficiencies, they love standardization. So yeah, I'm totally seeing what you're seeing, Hartland, where this particular roll up over here is ConnectWise. We've already bought whatever it is, 10 different MSPs, and they are all on ConnectWise. That said, and so therefore, to your second point, basically, if you are a Kaseya shop, that's going to make it harder to get a deal done with this company that or acquirer that's all in on ConnectWise. That said, I think the things that matter most to a purchasing MSP haven't really changed. Even with the roll-ups, it's about EBITDA. It's about the percentage of your revenue that is recurring. It's a lot of the classic metrics that measure success in managed services. So much so that I would say, if your EBITDA numbers are big enough, that ConnectWise standardized roll up might be willing to, you probably won't get the same money. There will be an impact on valuation, but they're not going to rule themselves out as a buyer just because they're going to have to do more work during the onboarding process with you. So I think the key things that matter most are the key things that have mattered most before, but it's shifting a little bit. There's some evolution there as we see these big roll-ups come into being and get bigger as they are right now.
And I think what we're talking about is that cost of the post-merger integration, right? Because when we complete a transaction, we want to integrate quickly. That is the number one rule of what we want to do. And it's platforms, it's financials, it's HR, it's all these things, right, Hartland? And anything that causes a delay in that post-merger integration creates real costs and that's what's going to impact that valuation. Like you said, Rich, I mean, the desire to acquire an organization is going to be based on financial metrics first, culture fit, churn, all these other things. But at the end of the day, if the decision comes down to, well, you're on this other platform and we're on ConnectWise, it's that cost of the post-merger integration and the failed, growth or profit that is going to occur the longer we delay that integration. Like transitioning someone to a completely different PSA solution is a heavy lift.
Yeah.
But it may make sense to the buyer and the seller in the big scheme of things, just depending on what their strategy is. Now, another factor could be that the seller has, a specialization or some IP or something that makes them so unique and attractive that fills a gap in the buyer's stack. So that's a more strategic acquisition rather than a financial kind of a acquisition. So there may be some value there where the buyer may say, well, yeah, but you have, this cybersecurity thing figured out, and that's the gap that we have, and we know that when we deliver it to our 2,000 customers, boy, that revenue increase and the profit margin is well worth making that consideration. So there's, it's not as black and white as some folks might think. There's a lot that goes into these discussions, right?
And yeah, no, look, so there's the willingness to overlook some of those painful aspects for the value that will ultimately be created. The other piece that I was thinking about that I forgot to mention earlier in preparation for this call was a vendor lock-in, right? So in situations where there's some kind of contractual relationship that has the seller bound to some term, and that will of course also impact valuations because now the buyer has to sort of wait it out, sit it out, and so to your point, Eric, now that integration can't be done quickly, or if it is done quickly, it's done at a price because, hey, now we're paying for redundancy. Essentially, we got the same solution being provided by two different vendors, and just just pay that contract out or let it run its course. But that's another thing, and I know that increasingly vendors are some of them, and I certainly see a lot of comments on Reddit and other places around vendors pushing MSPs to sign these longer term 3-year plus agreements. Do you have any comments on those or that point?
Hey, if it's good for the goose, right? I mean, MSPs want longer term agreements too. But yeah, I mean, the only comment that I would have is just in agreeing with you. I mean, you've got to, and that comes out during due diligence, right? When we're kind of evaluating, the opportunity and due diligence, you're going to find out, the agreements with customers, the agreements with vendors, and the term and conditions and the duration and all that. So, I mean, eyes wide open if you're working with somebody that knows what they're doing, like you do, Hartland. You're going to uncover all these things and make an educated decision upon what the valuation might look like.
So let me end with this question then, and it's a spicy question, let's say. Is we've got these conferences, and before the session began, Eric and Rich and I were just talking about upcoming conferences that we're attending. I'm going to IT Nation, so here we are. We've got the exhibit hall. We've got all these vendors, and they're of course hoping to sign on MSPs as their customers. Do they have a place, and will they have a place long term? Because of course, many of these over the years have become part of the ecosystem or the platform, if you like, already. But there's lots of independent ones, and presumably some of those will become will get nurtured and become part of those ecosystems as well. But some of them probably never will. Some of them maybe won't make it. And so, are we kind of creating an environment that's providing this confusion for these MSPs and creating problems for them by having it's a bit of the shiny object syndrome. Oh, I need some of that, and let's take some of this, and let me sign up here.
Yeah, it's not an easy thing for an MSP to navigate. But what happens quite often is some new need appears. Smaller, younger, more nimble startups come in to meet that need, and all of a sudden you've got another 5 vendors in the market now, and MSPs have to kind of evaluate, compare them to each other, and do I need any of these solutions, and if I do, which one? And then sometimes, but not always, what started out as something new and different kind of gets incorporated into these larger platforms. I'm not quite prepared yet to say that's what we're seeing right now in SaaS management, for example. But it's not a small thing that in the last 18 months, 2 years, we've seen Kaseya make some strides in that area. ConnectWise just bought Skykick. Like, you're starting to see some of these big names belatedly get into a market that was owned by much smaller companies. And there's a real question about whether or not there will be a bunch of companies in that space down the road. And that's kind of the dynamic. There are times when you're never going to see, vendor consolidation in terms of a particular technology need. And then there are a lot of others where over time, just as there aren't a lot of standalone spreadsheet or presentation vendors out there. Over time, as these use cases prove themselves, you see fewer vendors and more of the bigger vendors doing what, like as clearly alluding to Office before, as Erick says, what we're seeing Microsoft do now in terms of the ever expanding breadth of what it offers out there is it's a very classic old school Microsoft play to just do more and more of what people need in security.
Yeah, and my only tag on comment is there's a very real possibility that, a vendor that you are doing business with and love the relationship with may be acquired by your choice PSA vendor's competitor. Yeah. Right? So we're seeing that happen, and we're seeing a lot of, buzz, in the news about this when, partners get up in arms when, one of their favorite vendors gets acquired by somebody that they do not do business with today, and now they've got a tough decision to make, right? So it's an interesting ecosystem that we all participate in, isn't it?
And let me make it even worse than that, is the group that just migrated out of that environment, and then their platform got acquired by the group that they tried to move away from. That's just salt in the wound. So certainly seen that as well. Wow, this has all been really good. I had one other comment I was just thinking of that seems to me to be pertinent is, Erick, as you know, and Rich, perhaps you knew, but we still do a reasonable amount of work in the web hosting industry, but that is ultimately at one time where we started. And so, I've kind of seen this movie once. It's almost like living a second life in some ways, because what happened in that space is that there was a tremendous amount of consolidation on all fronts, exactly as it's playing out in the MSP space. But what happened is that the vendors were finding that, hey, I used to have, let's say, for instance, I used to have 1,000 customers, but when all those customers start getting consolidated, and now those 1,000 customers become 20 or 50 MSPs, now there's that ecosystem is much smaller. And then, of course, through those acquisitions, each of those MSPs or private equity groups or whoever are making decisions on the vendors that they want to use. And so it becomes more and more difficult for those vendors to now go out into the market and go find new business, because, hey, they keep running up against the giant that owns all these brands. For instance, if the brands were consolidated, it becomes sort of one key customer. And so a lot of the vendors either sort of went out of business. It just didn't make sense for them because the market just wasn't there. There were no more doors to knock on, and I think at some point maybe that's a path that this space will follow as well. We're a ways away, but.
In a sense, we've come full circle, though. That puts a kind of a perfect bow on the conversation, because we started talking about the number of vendor relationships that people have. So when you're in a landscape where there is some degree of consolidation happening among MSPs, I don't want to exaggerate it, but we're seeing to some extent fewer bigger MSPs, which is part of the dynamic you were kind of talking about there, Hartland. And at the same time, those MSPs are actively trying to reduce the number of relationships that they have. That is a tough environment, a more competitive environment for the vendors. And yeah, it wouldn't, it doesn't surprise me, or wouldn't surprise me at all, if that proves to be fatal in a sense for some of these vendors. Is they just can't outcompete to be one of those fewer vendor relationships that these bigger partners are looking to have.
Hartland, I have a question for you. I mean, you talk about the data center, the environment and all that. What impact is AI having now? I mean, are these folks that kind of went out of business or kind of just got out? going to rue the day because AI requires all of this, storage and compute and all this? I mean, what's your take?
Well, it's somewhat of a timely question because I was just in Las Vegas about 2 weeks ago at another event, and it was related to let's say, infrastructure and data centers. And AI was, of course, the theme probably at every conference, but in this case, as it pertains to that space, it is absolutely driving the underlying space. I mean, you think about hosting and all these environments, but they're all running ultimately in data centers, and these data centers require a tremendous amount of power. And so AI, much like Bitcoin, is using a lot of power. And so it's having implications for the growth of that space, the locations of these data centers that need to be near power, you put all these layer all these requirements on around power, around safe locations, where there are people who can support the space, where there's land, and power is reasonably priced. It really starts to make this a more difficult sort of exercise, and then AI is getting involved with the power management of data centers and so forth. So I don't profess to be an expert, but it was definitely a very hot topic. Pardon the pun, and so I think it's going to revolutionize everything, but certainly this space as well. And that's never mind all of the AI that's underlying security solutions and all that kind of stuff. I mean, we that's a different topic, but
yeah, that's the tie-in, right? Because it's permeating the platforms and the applications and the services that MSPs are using, as well as everyday consumers.
Yeah. Guys, any closing thoughts here? I want to be respectful of your time, so I really appreciate it. And anything you want to say in passing, add to this conversation?
So if you want to find out more about me, catch me on LinkedIn, Channelholic for Rich, channelmastered.com for the work we do with vendors. Sorry, Rich, I stepped on your outro. But
you were reading my mind.
I was a flub on Channel Mastered there, but just look to continue the conversation and engage. Thank you, Hartland, for having me on. Rich?
Yeah, no, I was going to say the same thing. If you want to learn more about Channel Mastered, www.channelmastered.com is where you're going to find information about that. I will do this. I'll do you this favor, Eric, because Eric has two businesses, and the other one where he's working directly with MSPs is called MSP Mastered, and that one you can learn more about at www.mspmastered.com. And once again, my blog, Channelholic, is at www.channelholic.news.
Excellent. Well, thank you guys so much. Again, I really appreciate it. Rich, look forward to seeing you in a month or so, or whatever. Yeah, a little less, actually, I guess. And Eric, our paths, I'm sure, will cross again soon. So thanks, guys, and really appreciate it.
Thanks for having us, Hartland.
Thank you very much. My pleasure.
Thanks.